and it's as a means to the generation of art, or the creation of art. The medium as a means to creation, a means to creativity. And what I mean by that, ultimately, what that signifies is that the work, the print medium, can be viewed as a kind of vehicle for the expression of ideas. Okay, for the expression of content, the carrier of content. And so with that idea, I think I'm going to hand out the assignment. Yes, there's an assignment. There's the first assignment for semester 1. The assignment for the first half of this semester when you were doing your electives was specific to those electives. And it was only half of the overall assignment. I thought it was just a vicious rumble. So that's your assignment. They're essentially in the same mood as the previous assignment. The titles are intended as stimuli for to get you to think about the medium of the discipline that you've selected. So think about print as a medium, as a means rather than an end. Rather than seeing the actual, like seeing a work, say print, and saying, that's horrible, or that's old-fashioned, or I don't like that, I don't like the content. It's about kind of seeing beyond that and going, well actually, how did the artist achieve that effect? And I want to be able to, use that effect, or utilize that effect, a very pragmatic way, in my work. To actually learn about the process through the studying of and researching of printmaking. So it's about thinking of, in terms of process rather than product. That's what I'm trying to get you to think about. Now I know that, I suppose, the course in the program in the first semester and in the first half of the second semester was kind of orientated towards process. Well, I'm just emphasising that again. But here, in a theoretical sense rather than practical. Alright? So each one of these questions, and you just select one of them, is designed purposely to get you to think about the process itself, as opposed to maybe the product. To get behind, the way I like to see it is, there's history sedimented in every work of art, and you can unpick that history. You can follow that history back, you can unravel it back to the first mark that was made on the surface of whatever you're examining. And often that's a conceptual process that can't really ever, be practically applied. Like you can't actually practically apply white spirits to the surface and actually arrange back through all the history of marks and the genealogy of how the work emerged. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a practical, literal tracing or unfurling or unraveling. I'm talking about a kind of a revisiting of the artist's decisions, conceptually and cognitively, in the imagination. So that you can then understand something about that process in your own practice. The process of from the first mark to the last, if you like. Or the first decision to the last. To the final and ultimate decision. So that's the way to engage with it. That's what I'm trying to stress, is an engagement with process. To think about process, to think about the medium. Think about the medium as the message. Or better, the medium as the vehicle for the message, the medium as a carrier for it. The medium conveys the statement, if you like. Okay? And it conveys more than the statement, because often the medium will be carried as well as unconscious motivations in work too. So, there are 5 options there that you can select. And you can go down through them yourself. If you've got any questions, you can ask me next week. Okay? But they're relatively straightforward, and each one of them is asking the same thing, but in a different variation. Okay? Yeah?
Here. Is there another assignment from you after Easter, or is this the only assignment you get from me?
This is the only one.
Yeah.
This is the last assignment you'll get for CCS.
Yes.
Okay. So the first one was kind of the last assignment you did, the first one for the second semester, that is the one on the 3 different genres or frameworks, and then one example for each is was much more generic than this one. This is specifically about print. Like every single question here relates to printmaking, or artists at least who use printmaking processes in their work. So the kind of argument that I've been developing is that the ukiyo-e aesthetic, that is the aesthetic of the Japanese woodblock printmaking in the 17th century, somehow constitutes a kind of aesthetic framework that has had affinities with the printmaking technique, with artists who use print right up to the present day. Somehow the floating world aesthetic, the philosophy of the floating world, that is the ephemerality of everyday life, that is like the provisional, contingent nature of everyday life, the fact that everything is passing, we live in the moment, in the present, and the future doesn't exist yet, and the past is always gone, somehow constitutes the essence of the printmaking aesthetic, or at least the aesthetic for artists who use printmaking. In other words, artists who use printmaking in their work use it because they have been influenced to a certain extent by the floating world aesthetic, whether they are aware of that or conscious of that or not. Okay? Because printmaking lends itself to that ephemeral idea, the idea that everything is passing, everything is in flux. The doctrine of eternal flux somehow relates very closely to printmaking, to the motivation of artists who use print, because they're using it for something of that quality, to represent that quality, to represent something of that quality. But also, every artist is unconsciously influenced by what's gone before, the history of their medium. When you choose a medium, you choose it for a reason. It's like a kind of a resonance, a formal, morphic resonance that is in the atmosphere, and you choose printmaking. Often, when you choose it, you choose the history as well. Okay, and that history has been determined or defined by the floating world philosophy from the 17th century. And it had a massive influence, particularly in the 19th century Impressionists. And of course, everybody knows you all should know where the modernist aesthetic began. Modernism began with what work anyway? Anyone know? The aesthetic modernism, the history of modernism, modern art, modern painting began with?
Duchamp.
No. I mean, it's a kind of a convenient, pragmatic cut-off point or beginning. But generally speaking, the work, like the history of modernism, modern art, begins with one painting, conventionally in the history of art. That is Manet's Olympia. Okay? Manet's Olympia. At the time, interestingly, Parisian artists there was a state of hysteria and fascination about Japanese printmaking, because this was the first time that the West had actually seen and appreciated the work that had been done in Tokyo or Edo in the 17th century. And so a lot of artists were really influenced, including Manet. But of course, Manet's Olympia was also influenced by what other invention, discovery around the middle of the 19th century? Yes, exactly. Okay, and you could actually argue that the way Olympia's unmodulated form looks blank because of him studying daguerreotypes, and because of the overexposure, there was a high contrast between the lights and darks. Okay, so there's actually evidence that he was looking at the daguerreotypes when he was painting Olympia. So photography conspired with painting in its own downfall. And here's an example of an artist in the 19th century who used printmaking and who was deeply, profoundly influenced by the it's Mary Cassatt. Okay? And again, her images were actually, direct translations of the floating world aesthetic to 19th century everyday life. So she observed these kind of quiet scenes of people in the tram or in the bus, traveling, mothers with children, childcare, private kind of moments that had never really been explored in the history of art up to that time. But as I said, the interesting thing about Mary Cassatt is how contemporary the prints actually look, how contemporary her style was. She was, as I said, profoundly and directly influenced by the Japanese technique, but she used etching, colour etching. So this is colour etching and dry point. She was really adept at dry point. I think I looked at a black and white, I examined black and white one before. But here the colour one is very interesting because the relationships between the colours and the plates and how she achieved that chromatic appearance is very interesting. Because with printmaking, particularly colour etching, you have to use an economy of colours in order to achieve that overall kind of polychromatic effect. But also the subtlety of the colours too is quite interesting from a printmaking technique. But what her technique was to use different plates in appleton, ink them up in the different colours, and superimpose them in the actual printing. So again, you have like different plates for different colours, and then the tones are achieved using aquatints, very light aquatints there and lighter, so that would be less time in the acid there where you see the kind of effects on the water. But again, the interesting aspect here for me is her line. Her line is this kind of nervous, scratchy line because in order to get the line, she didn't actually etch the line in, she dry pointed it. She used the dry point, so there's all this kind of sketchy marks around that give a really kind of interesting effect of flux, but also of things moving. You see the lines trying to, the changes of mind there around these lines, scratching around, trying to find the shape of the boat, actually gives the effect of the boat moving at the end. With me? But she used these dry points, because with dry point as well, you can get a really fine line, you can achieve a real fineness of line. And she was very interested in detail, like the hair on the model, as you'll see in the next. And one of her most famous prints. When she was an impressionist now who was she was an impressionist who I think her vision was better. It's really hard to She was very involved with the discussions around aesthetics and artwork in the 19th century. And these discussions, today we think, we have to, when engaging with Impressionism, we tend to think of it as a kind of a completely tame and lame aesthetic, that, chocolate boxes, etc. But actually Impressionism was highly transgressive in its day. In its day, there was like mania among the artists about the development of a new style, a style that was supposed to be, represent everyday life, that was supposed to be relevant. And there was a huge kind of challenge to the history of art going on. And there was lots of discussion and kind of argument and debate. And she was right in the centre of it, one of the few women right in the centre of these debates. And she was a good friend of Degas, actually. And but for some reason she was attracted to printmaking processes in a way that none of her male contemporaries were. I mean, Degas did a lot of monoprints and stuff, but they're really just kind of studies for his paintings. But her works are works of art in their own right. She's one of the first to do that. Definitely the only impressionist to achieve, statement, body of work in print in her own right. Here again, another colour print, another colour etching and dry point, where she, built up the colours very gradually on the plate using aquapaint. So the tonal areas are actually very fine grain aquapaint. Okay? And probably there's some tipping of the plate in the acid to achieve these kind of lighter tonal areas. And probably, definitely in fact, the work of the scraper burnisher to pick out the white envelope there, scraping away the actual surface of the aquapaint plate. And then again, the lines, scratched in dry point lines. And you can see the detail in the hair there, for instance, was the kind of detail that I'm talking about that Cassatt favoured. And not just that, you can see very clearly here the influence of the ukiyo-e aesthetic.
What's the name of that print piece here?
The letter.
The letter.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And here is the comparison for us being made straight away between Cassatt and Japanese aesthetic. The reason why, of course, we study Cassatt is, again, we have to look beyond the content of the work, because the content of the work can seem quite lame to contemporary eyes. Again, it's not transgressive. There's nobody running around throwing buckets of blood or pissing into a hat, that kind of thing. There's none of that. This is a much quiet, more modest aesthetic. It's an aesthetic of domesticity. But Mary Cassatt was one of those artists who were kind of erased from the history of art, just simply because of their gender. Okay? So that's something to bear in mind as well. But here again, real economy of form, real sensitivity and excitement in the line itself, and a kind of a vibrancy about, just again, the economy, the simplicity of the form, the mixture of kind of confidence and nervousness in the line is something that I really appreciated because I was working with it. Because of its unique stylistic effects. All right, so that's Mary Cassatt. And I briefly referred to her last week before the projector died on me, and I resurrected it, henceforth known as Lazarus. Resurrected it last week, but I think it's on its last legs because I can see kind of this. So we might just have enough time to cover what I want to cover. So last week I stopped in the middle of Katie Culver's, didn't I? I showed you some of her work. Now she's, kind of spans the period of pre-war Germany, then the Weimar Republic between the wars, and then even afterwards. She died, in actual fact, the year the Second World War ended in 1945. But again, she was she was a master of the technique as well. And I think I showed you that one last week. Did I? Right from the Weber cycle. She worked in cycles. She selected a theme and then did a series of prints based on the theme. So there's a narrative in her work all the time. And this was one of her early cycles. It was called The Weavers. And she worked in it from 1894 to 1898. And it was a set of 6 prints. She did many, many more prints, but was dissatisfied with them and destroyed them. But here are some of the remaining ones. And like I said last week, I think I mentioned this, it was based on Gerhard Hauptmann's play The Weavers. And that play in turn was based on the revolution of the Silesian weavers in 1804. Because Colvitz's work can be regarded as a kind of a social engagement, political artist. She was sensitive to the social issues, the ethical issues, the moral issues of exploitation of everyday exploitations and everyday oppressions. And she wanted to, in some way, be the first to represent the working class in art. So her work is an aesthetics of resistance, if anything. And that term I get from Peter Weiss, his great book, The Aesthetics of Resistance, is actually a revolution. constitutes a revolution in the approach, theoretical approach to studying works of art. And what he always emphasizes is the process. I'm trying to follow that. So, according to this writer here, which is Ziegrosser, and this book is in line with a very famous book on Collins. Now, most of what I'm talking about is actually deriving from this. Collins is a dramatic artist who dealt with human emotions and drama evoked through subtle gesture and what he calls facial expression. So this is a Weaver cycle, like I said, and this is called Writing. And last week, the moment she picks here, the dramatic moment, is where the weavers, the women, are collecting, or breaking up the cobbles on the actual pavement, collecting them in their skirts, and then passing them to the men to throw at the boss's house. Okay. But what's interesting about the work itself is Colvitz's use of sandpaper. What's known as sandpaper accurate. Did I talk about that last week? Soft ground, and then sandpaper on top, running through the press, and then you get this kind of speckled effect. See that? Which is perfect for kind of capturing the corrosion of and the texture of stone. See what I'm talking about? But it's an all over pattern, so it's going to be picked up all over the plane in some shape or form. But it adds a texture to it, and you can see that. And other than that, it's just line. So she just added this texture, and then just scraped into the surface of the wax with lines. So there's some very fine lines around the hands in particular. Like Colvitz always focused on the most expressive parts of the human body, the hands and the face. But for her, they were the ones that told us about the life of the individual. They communicated something about the individual. So work-worn hands here. So she's really concentrated on those areas and on the faces as well. See the child there being held by the mother, the child there being encouraged to dig up some of the cobbles, and a man then reaching here for more stone. But you can see that the rest of it is quite sketchy as opposed to the faces and the hands. And maybe even more concentration on hands than on faces. You with me? So there's very kind of, these would have been very fine lines and etched very shallow, for a very short time in the acid. Whereas these ones were etched much longer, these heavily bitten lines here. Okay. There's a lot of detail on the gates as well there. And in the background, of course, as well, would have been in the acid only for a very short time. So she's thinking about the relative densities of the line. So that would have been in the acid about 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 different stages in order to achieve the difference in density, and the difference in texture, and the difference in darkness and depth of the lines. Okay? Because that's what it all comes down to in print media. This is the conspirators, I showed you that last week, and that's a lithograph. She ranged across all the different print media, except for silkscreen, lithography, a series of lithographs, and etching. And then woodblock as well, which I'm going to show you in a second. Her last cycle was concerned with the theme of death. And it was like from... Her last cycle on the theme of death was around the 30s, I think it was, 1934 or 35. It was an eight little sequence on the theme of death. Now this isn't a little, this is an etching as well. But so this is probably earlier. But it was always something that she was concerned with. Now, she did a lot of self-portraits as well. Her lithographs are very expressive. And as I said, the stones that she uses are very roughly ground. So there's quite a lot of texture already in there. And again, the emphasis being on the hands and the faces in this kind of huddled group. Her woodcuts then, again, are extraordinary for their kind of blend again of mixture of crudity and subtlety. I mean, that's what I always think of in college. There's a perfect kind of contrast or conflict between, or tension between subtlety and crudity. I mean, some of the faces, the cuts are so crude, but yet she's thinking of the face in a holistic, she's thinking of the head in a holistic sense of the way shadow will pick out, shadow and light, and the interplay of shadow and light will pick out the form. And that's what she's doing. So there's great subtlety in the actual approach to the sculpting of the head and the sculpting of the hands, but the actual cuts themselves are crude, right? But notice the way she resists the line. Her work rejects line. She doesn't want to put a line around something, a black line I'm talking about, around something, and then, cut it out. This is much more sculptural, thinking in terms of solidity, of solid forms, of things that actually take up room. Now, in this, though, she has used the chisel to excise actual lines in white. So, and a lot of this is very crude again, just picking out the forms for us. But again, like I said last week, the viewer has to do a lot of work to piece the information together from the little clues that we get. Okay, and this is the memorial for Karl Liebknecht, who was a member of the Spartacus group, and he was killed in 1919 by the socialist government. Okay, because he was trying to instigate along Rosa Luxemburg a revolution, a communist socialist revolution in Germany. Here's a date of Karl Liebknecht lying on the tomb itself. Okay, he was assassinated, but the official word that went out was he was shot while trying to escape from custody. Okay. Again, the very interesting understanding, implicit understanding of the way light will pick up different highlights on the surface of something like that. So it's underlit, because you can see the detail on the nose there, the lips, the teeth, the chin. And you see how minimalist it is, but yet how convincing it is as a solid form. You with me? Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. It's when she. I just want to. But before I go on to the next stage, I want to look at some more from her early stage as well, where her work was much more ornate and more detailed, and if you like, more kind of overworked. This one, Raped, is incredibly complex because, again, there's a lot of sandpaper aquatint, there's large grain aquatint, there's soft ground in this as well, and then there's straightforward line etching too. And you can see, and it's like incredibly detailed on the feet and on the human form. You can see the head back there with some dry points to kind of obliterate the features. And then the garment is simply just aquatint. Okay, and dry point actually to get some of the darkness there. Okay. There could be some, in fact, as well in this. It looks to me like there could be some carborundum colograph. Does that make sense to you? Carborundum colograph is you put the glue on the plate and then sprinkle carborundum on it. You get these very, very dense blacks on the surface. But again, the detail in the flowers and foliage too, a lot of which is lost in this shadow up there of aquatint. But that's one of her early pieces from the 1920s. Okay. This is one of the theme of death again. And the interesting point about this is how expertly she's used the sandpaper aquatint. Okay, which was she was that was her kind of signature style. Because here in the child, there's actually no line at all on the legs and the form of the child. It's just the sandpaper aquatint that she's used bitumen to find the form, and then before putting it in the acid. So literally here we just have a sprinkling of texture that finds the child's form. It gives again a very convincing kind of sense of the texture of the form, doesn't it? Or am I just talking into the void here? I sometimes think I just go blah 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 dinner, blah 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 coffee. And here death is taking the cycle. This was influenced by, as I said before, a very important theme right through the history of art, which is the theme of the dance of death. Death being personified here allegorically as a skeleton. Okay? Grabbing the woman away. So there's quite a lot of violence in that image. And there's violence in her work in general. And the violence being given by, in the last one as well, rape, for instance, and in the actual form itself. But in Colbett's, the violence and the harshness is raised to the level of form. You know, she's literally digging into the surface, which is quite unusual. Okay, this one is an image again of death. No, of a parent picking through dead bodies on the battlefield, looking for her son. And again, all of this almost illegible. Again, use of sandpaper aquatints, but trying to find the form here, which is almost lost. And the thing that she picks out and highlights is just again the hand, the incredible detail on the hand. Again, most of which is linear, but the lines are so small, and the hatching is so tiny and so detailed and so precise that it's blending into tone. And then the face here again is also very, very subtly picked out, using incredibly rich detail in the lines. And then, of course, all of this mass of bodies is made anonymous through being lost in the aquatint and the greys of the mid-tones. Here we can see a face that's almost obliterated with the use of line. Her use of line is very distinctive. These long, not cross-hatched, but long kind of parallel hatching in one direction. What she uses one direction. What she uses is she uses the direction of the lines themselves to pick out the form. Do you know what I'm talking about? The direction. If the form is going like at an oblique angle, her parallel lines or hatching will follow that angle in order to give us the notes that we need for the reading of the form, for the reading of the directions of the form and how it's sculpted. That's a pretty interesting piece, again, from a printmaking perspective. I think there's a lot of manipulation, just quickly before I leave, there's a lot of manipulation afterwards, using scraped burnishes and probably sandpaper afterwards on the actual surface of the plate, rubbing out these areas here to give that fogginess in the background, that mist from the fog of war. Now her war cycle of wood blocks from around, which was published in 1908, contained some of these. It was kind of a very strange transition for her to move from etching to wood blocks. But here, again, in the widow, the form here is completely just silhouette, black, followed and cut out so that it blends into the whiteness of the paper itself. So the form again is picked out in this kind of elliptic profile manner, and then again the emphasis is on the hands and on the expression in the face. We're particularly excellent at, as I said before, the way light will play upon the surface to actually sculpt out the convincing volumetric solidity of the form. Because, you know, this is again is a very crude technique, and you need, in order to attain subtle effects, you need to find the economy, the most economic way of doing it. And she has definitely found that there. You see the way the baby's face is totally just the shadow bleeding into darkness there. And the way the shadow has encroached everything, and the hand is just made up of a few very abbreviated marks, very abbreviated cuts. So yeah, and again in the face here. And again, the wornness of the face is emphasized by the fact that it's hewn out of wood. As I mentioned last week as well, the Gestalt way that we read these images is that the viewer has to do quite a lot of work to read more into what is actually given to us. So you always read more into less, as it were. You read more than what is there. And the Gestalt psychologists call this pregnancy. Every image is pregnant with more information than it actually has. And the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You know, we're actually seeing more here than the information that Collins is giving us in this huddle of bodies. Okay? Called the mothers. Alright, so that's Katie Corbin's. Kind of is very influential. The work still looks quite contemporary today, I think. Another artist that's worth studying, not for the content of his work, but in terms of its technique, is Max Klinger, who was actually who influenced Colvin's work and his style. And he was an artist who focused exclusively on etching. Okay, but a plate like this is highly complex, and if you forgive the kind of the romantic iconography and the motifs he's turned out, and forgive the fact that he's actually not a great draftsman, a printmaker can learn so much from studying these in terms of technique. In this, there's very little aquatent in this work, in this etching. It's all done with line. But there isn't one part of this plate that isn't covered in some way with a mark. Okay, it's completely covered, it's all over. Even the highlights have, again, the traces of and betray the use of the sandpaper aquatent in these kind of speckled textures, random surface. But how he achieves all the different tones that he does in something like this, while using line, by just using line, is the amount of time it's spent in the acid. Take it out of the acid, put it in the acid, sorry, take it out, and then block out certain areas with bitumen, put it back, block out other areas, put it back, block out other areas, and so on and so forth, until he builds up the highest density of blackness that he requires. Okay, and that's what I mean about the history of the plate. If you look at the top, for instance, here, where the trees and the branches are being selectively isolated and picked out. You can see here very clearly that's just uses just a bitumen there as well before he puts it back in the acid. And the lines are these are just cross-hatched lines that are much shallower than the dark forms and darknesses around them. So he's just going in here with bitumen. After he pulls it out of the acid, he paints bitumen on here and here and here and here, right? And here and there and behind there and there and there. Just picking out the trees in reverse. Do you see what I'm doing? And you see what I'm talking about? Like these are just cross-hatched lines. So he obviously frenetically went across the plate like that. If you go down to the church gallery today, you see June Savage's drawings, okay, on the wall. Two great drawings. Again, every part of those drawings are covered with line. Okay, in the same way as here. He's not interested in making lines like this. Lines here become just out of tone. See, and then much more detailed on the tree's trunk. They're much shallower lines. But here it's just cross-hatching, frenetic cross-hatching. Then goes back using aquatent to pick out the tree. So he didn't have any trees on there first. He just had a whole mass of lines, cross-hatched lines, and then went in with the bitumen and in reverse picked out the branches using and then put it back in the acid, then put it back out and put more bitumen on until in the end probably that was the last there, because the last period of time the acid, that was the longest in the acid, where all the lines are so heavily etched that they're all blending into each other and you just get tiny little specks of white. Does that all make sense? It's just like reworking, working in reverse. But it's something that, again, you can apply quite effectively to your own etchings when it comes to the time to do your etchings. The stream here, it gets that sense of water flowing using coarse ground aquatent. Again, in the church gallery there are two prints by Dietrich Blodau, who was actually my tutor when I was in college, and two cityscapes, street scenes down there, really good again. Where you'll see some of these techniques actually applied in the etching format. There's also two beautiful dry points by Dave Wilbur, two colour dry points, light grey and black. But in this one, the reason I show this one is for the technique again. It's nothing really more than coarse ground aquatent to get these white speckles on the surface of the road, and that gives the effect of the light glistening on the wet road. So coarse ground aquatin there, and a very short time the acid, you've got very, very light grey, it's almost imperceptible. But the reason I showed this one is for the sky, the dramatic sky, right? How did he achieve that? Because we can see that down in the church in Dietrich's print as well, the same technique. How you get that is, that's open ground, or open bite. Now open bite is where you don't put any aquatin on the surface at all, you allow the acid just to affect the surface. You get a very, very light, dead grey. That's what people avoid open bite, because it's a dead grey that you get. But here, he wants a dead grey for the sky, to get that sullen sky to create the atmosphere. But what he does is, he tips the plate in the acid. He tips it up, so he's washing the plate back and forth in the acid, so that it's biting in a very kind of gradual, gradated way. Okay? So it's darker down here and lighter up there, because it's being bitten more here, because he's washing it up and down like that. It's create this gradual movement from dark to light. And of course, all of this would have been stopped out of bitumen. I use bitumen, it's probably wax or something that he used. And again, to forgive the clumsiness and the kind of naivety of the imagery, but it's worth studying for this as it's worth studying, researching this just for the aquatin technique. You know, the difference, the way that he's used the mid-tone greys there to get the folds and the light on the drapery, but also at the top around Death's hat. That's an example of coarse ground aquatin. Okay, much harsher than this kind of aquatin here, which is much finer. So again, the relationship between, if you want to know the difference between coarse ground and fine ground aquatin, it's there in that plate, in those two sections. Right? For the effects, if you want to kind of achieve those effects in your own etchings. So it's worth studying Klinger simply for technique. This is mezzotint and aquatint and etching. In the sky, very light, linear for these phantoms, phantasmagoria of gods fighting and flying in the sky or whatever. Very light again, but a little darker in the sky, so longer in the acid. For the sea, which again is all done with line. But then the foreground figures are achieved by using a technique called mezzotint. Has anyone come across that technique? So we cover the surface of the plate with a tiny matrix of dots that are actually literally dug into the surface of the plate using a tool called a rocker. A tool called a rocker. But you can use other techniques as well. But what happens is you coat the surface of the plate, you dig up the surface of the plate with this rocker, so there's a fine matrix of dots. And if you then put ink into that surface and print it up, you'll get a total black. So what you do is you work back into it with scraper burnisher, scraping it out. And that's what he's done there. Okay. Scraping out to get all these tones. So it's a reverse technique again. And that's mezzotint. And mezzotint is very good for that, to achieve that kind of shadowy, indistinct form. You don't get anything like any detail with mezzotint. What you do get is a velvety blackness, real deep, intense black. So if that's what you want to achieve, then you use mezzotint. Now, very quickly as well, I know that I think you're doing collagraphs, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just very, if I may, show you examples of Dean Meeker's work. He's a contemporary American printmaker. And he does collagraphs, and that's what, these are the collagraphs. These are examples of his collagrammetry.
It's not saying anything.
Meeker, M-E-E-K-E-R. He's really inventive printmaker. He's really experimental. He designs and invents presses, you know, and modifies existing presses in order to get these kind of levels of structure in his work, so that they can cope with really sculptural, built up collagraphs. And he mixes them usually with silkscreen then as well to get the colours But these are just, I mean, this is the great thing about collagraphs. You can get real painterly effects, like Rembrandt type effects, where you can see the textures on the surface. Where he uses various kind of implements and brushes and that to get these highly textured forms on the surface. Can you see that there, like even in the background here? And that's the kind of hallmark of collagraph. The collagraph form here as well. You can get some very. That's what I'm saying about Rembrandt. That looks like a Rembrandt glaze, even though it's just like it's just adhesive or acrylic painted onto the surface, but it picks up all these tiny details, random details, textures once it's printed up, when it's dried. And then here you can do this kind of thing as well. You can impress textures onto the glue, and you get that kind of thing. That's just lace that he's impressed onto the surface. And here, with the hair, what does he do? He just gets a comb. Get a comb. If you want something to look like something, just use that thing. And so he gets the lines of the hair very convincingly with the comb. And then the face then is left completely almost black. And there's his Joseph's coat. Again, building up these very highly painterly forms using collagraph. So with that, I'll leave it for this week. And I've given you out to your assignment outline. Yeah.